Let's talk about middlewares. Middleware is pretty important concept, and while it may sound complicated, it's actually pretty straightforward once you understand its purpose and functionality. Think of middlewares as series of filters or layers that requests must pass through before reaching your application. They typically sit in between your requests and controllers, allowing you to inspect, modify, and even stop requests based on certain criteria. Many frameworks, Laravel included, come with middleware support out of the box. Laravel by default has some middlewares that it already goes through for every request that are kind of hidden away within the framework. Let's see some of them to get a better understanding on how it exactly works. I have this app.php open here, which is from the Bootstrap directory. And here we see a method called with middleware, where a closure is being passed and it's just left empty for us to fill it in. This is where we would define the custom middlewares, but before we do that, let's inspect this method for now. So let's click into this. And right here in the documentation, we see right away that this is used to register the global middleware, middleware groups, and middleware aliases for the application. Now, if we start reading the source code, we see that after the HTTP kernel class is resolved, Laravel then is registering some middlewares. So if we scroll down a little bit here, we see that it's registering or setting the global middlewares, then the middleware groups, and middleware aliases. And you don't need to understand what exactly each of these means yet. It's just pretty simple to understand what this with middleware method does, because you can read the documentation or the comment here that explains what this middleware what this method does, and then you can check the actual implementation of it, and it's pretty readable, right? I mean, this says that after resolving the HTTP kernel, we want to do something with the middleware and register some additional middlewares like the global middleware, the groups, and all that. Now, of course, it does some of the other things like, this section here and also something with the priorities, but without knowing all of that, you can get pretty good idea what this method does by simply just investigating and looking into the method definition and its implementation. So let's dissect this a little bit. In Laravel, you're able to register middlewares globally, which means that every HTTP request going in your application will have to go through all of the global middlewares. If we click on this Get Global Middleware here, we can see the default global middlewares that Laravel uses. For example, if you were to put your application in maintenance mode using the artisan command, this is the middleware that would prevent requests going through. We also have a middleware to validate the post size, trim strings, and so on. Now, how can we register our custom or a new middleware globally to be somehow part of this list in here? Well, first, and the recommended way is, of course, to just check the documentation on Laravel docs page. You can search the middleware there, and it will explain it to you how to exactly add the new middleware. However, you can also learn how to do that without documentation by simply doing what I'm doing right now, going through the source and digging into it and understanding how it works. And then once you know how it works, you also know how to register it. And while this is a bit more involved and takes a bit more time, I think it's better way in the beginning when you're learning the framework, because it gives you that foundational knowledge that you wouldn't really get from just reading the documentation. So if we kind of read through this get global middleware method and understand how it works, we should be able to add our own middlewares to it. So first here we're getting the default middlewares, right? Then we're doing some mapping to, I assume, do the replacements. And then right here, this is the important part. That's where essentially it's setting the middlewares right here. And then we have two additional properties here. One is the prepends and the other one is appends. And then we see that it's calling array merge, which means that it is merging the prepends middlewares, the middlewares that are passed here, and then the appends middlewares. And then it also removes some of the removable middlewares because it's using the array diff. So this right here already tells us that if we wanted to add our own custom middlewares, we would have to either add it to the prepends list or to the appends list. Because this code here, right, this is the framework code. So we're not going to be able to modify this directly. That's not how we should do. This is not the application code. The application code is app.php, for example. That's where we could make some changes. But here we can't. But we do see that this method here uses the prepends property and appends property and merges that with the middlewares. So if we were able to add our middleware to this or this, then we should be able to get that middleware registered along with the rest of the global middlewares that Laravel has by default. So the first thing that we can do is look into what these prepends and appends are. So let's click into this. We see that it's a protected property, which means that there is probably a public setter method or a public method that will allow us to add elements to this property. So let's search something like this prepends, and sure enough, we find it right away. And there is a method called prepend, and there is a method called append right here. So we can pass a list of middlewares or a single middleware, and it's going to add it to this prepends, and it's going to add it to this appends property. So appends would essentially add the middlewares to the end of the stack, and prepends would push the middlewares to the beginning of the global middleware stack. So the good news is we do have these public methods. Now, how do we call these methods? From our application code, because again, we cannot do this within the framework code, right? We need to call this from the application side so that we can add our own middlewares. So going back to the app.php here, we see that we have this with middleware method call, right? That accepts the closure. And this closure is getting the middleware instance here, which means that this middleware object right here is an instance of this class. So technically, we should be able to call prepend and append from here. And that's basically the way to add custom middlewares. If we go back to the application builder where this is defined, we see that the callback is being called right here, and the middleware object is being passed to it. So here we're first creating the middleware object, and then we're calling the callback right here that is passed to this with middleware method, passing in that middleware object, and then we're setting the global middleware, the middleware groups, and middleware aliases, and then it also sets some middleware priority right in here. So going back to the app.php, in here, we should be able to call the prepends or appends on that middleware object. So we can do something like middleware and do append and pass the middleware in here. Now, before we pass the middleware, we need to create a new middleware, right? Let's say we wanted to identify a request by some kind of ID, maybe for tracking purposes. Sometimes you want to track the entire request, and the request having some kind of unique ID makes it easier when digging through the logs if you're logging your requests. We could call that middleware something like assign request ID. And to create that middleware, we can use an artisan command called make middleware. So let's open a terminal and we'll do php artisan make middleware assign request ID. Once the middleware is created, it is created under the app http middleware directory. So we can open that up right here, open http middleware, and we have our new middleware. Now, middlewares in Laravel need to define the handle method, which accepts the request as the argument as well as the closure. Request is the current request, and the closure is basically to pass the request to the next middleware or to the next layer of the application to generate the response. So what this middleware does is that it takes in the request, does something to the request in here, and then passes it along to the next middleware in the chain. So we could put our logic here to do something with the request before it progresses further. However, you can take this and assign this to response like this, and then return response here. And if you put your logic in between, that means that your middleware logic will be applied after the response is generated. And you could do it both as well. You could execute logic here pass your request through the rest of the middlewares and through the rest of the application layers and generate the response, and then execute some more logic after the response is generated and return. Now we want to assign the ID to the request before we process the request, so we need to put our logic beforehand right here. So first, let's generate the request's unique ID. We can use the UUID for this case, and Laravel has a helper method to generate string UUIDs. So we can do request ID equals str from the Illuminate support, and we'll call the UUID here, and then cast this to string because the UUID returns an object, but that object implements the toString method. So if we cast it to string, this is just going to be a string UUID. All right, so once we have the UUID, we want to assign this to a request header. We can add the request header using the set method on the request headers object. So we can do something like request headers and then call set on it and do x request ID request ID. So as you can see, we're doing something with our request before we pass it along to the next middleware, and then we generate the response. Now, after we process the request, we also would want to add the request ID to the response header as well. So we would want to do that after the response is generated. So we can do something like response headers set and set the X request ID the same way. Now, as you might know, it's possible to add request IDs through a web server like Nginx, so it's probably a good idea to first check if the request ID is already set, and if it is set, then just use that instead of setting a new one. Otherwise, set the new request ID using our UUID. So we can add that logic right here. So we can do something like request ID equals to request headers get X request ID, and if this request ID is not set, then we are going to set it using this logic. So let's move that in here. Let's change this to request ID, and then we generate the response and we set the request ID on the response headers as well. Now, this is just an example, so in practice, you might have a slightly different way of assigning request IDs. Like I mentioned, you might do that at the web server level, but this is just a good example to show you the before and after middleware logic and how to use this middleware and then register it properly. All right, so let's try to register this middleware now. Let's go to the app.php. Let's add this middleware here. Assign request ID. Let's import that. Now let's dump the request ID somewhere in our routes. So let's open our maybe transaction controller. We have the index method here. Let's echo out the request ID from the headers. So we'll do echo request headers get, and we'll get the X request ID. And let's add a break line here. Let's open the browser. Let's go to /transactions, and sure enough, we see the request ID here. Let's open the DevTools so that we can actually confirm it's part of the response as well. Let's refresh the page, open transactions request, scroll down to response headers, and sure enough, we have that same request ID here. Now, you may or may not need the request ID in the response, but this is just a way to show you that you could add that in the response too, and you can add that logic after the response is generated within the middleware so that you can do some more stuff with the response before it's finally sent to the user. Now, you may want to have access to the request ID in between middlewares, in which case instead of appending it, you would prepend it, because this is appending assign request ID to the end of the global middleware stack. What if you wanted to have access to this request ID to some of the other middlewares that are registered before this? In that case, it would probably be better to prepend the request ID middleware instead of append, and it would work the same way, except that this would be prepended to the rest of the global middleware stack. Let's make sure that this still works. So let's go here, refresh the page, and sure enough, that works. In addition to registering middlewares globally, we can also register them for individual routes or a group of routes. Now, before we do that, I also want to mention that you could also even customize the entire default global middleware list and have full control over it within this with middleware method. If we go back to the definition of the get global middleware here, we can see that it only sets the default middlewares if the global property is empty. So if this global isn't set, only then it's using this default global middlewares. So that means again that if we can somehow manipulate this global property here, we could essentially have total and full control of what middlewares or what global middlewares are being registered. Now, I would suggest don't do this unless you know what you're doing and you have a specific reason. But it's good to know that you have that flexibility of having full control over it. So again, just like we did the prepends and appends, we can search for this global to see where it's being set. So we'll do this global, and we see that it is being set within the use method. And if you read the description here, we see that it says it defines the global middleware for the application. So we can pass list of middlewares here, and that's where it's being set. So that means that since this use method is a public method, we can call this from our application code, which is the app.php, on the middleware instance, because again, this is the middleware class. So we could do something like middleware use and then pass the list of middlewares here. So maybe let's say we wanted to define our own middleware somewhere in between one of those global middlewares. So let's go back here. Where was it? Yeah, in here. Let's say we wanted to define it somewhere in here. We wanted to add maybe one of our middlewares in between one of these middlewares. So you would then copy these lists and you would put it in here as an array. And then you would define your own middleware somewhere here. So like we could take this, for example. This is probably not a good example on where you would define the assign request ID, but just to show you as an example, you could just take this and put it here, and this would work. But again, I would not recommend you do this unless you know what you're doing, because then if the framework gets updated and they add an additional middleware, additional global middleware, you would have to then add that yourself in here. This basically just gives you the full control over the global middlewares that Laravel will use when the requests come in. All right, so let me get rid of this. And let me show you an example of how we could define a middleware for individual routes or a group of routes. Let's say we wanted to have a route that only admin users could access, like administration page that would let you manage your website. Let's define a route for it. So we'll open the web.php and we'll do something like route get administration. And then we're just gonna use the closure here instead of having a controller, just for demonstration purposes. And we'll return some secret admin page. And now, of course, if we open this page up, we don't even have a user, so you would pretty much just show you the secret admin page. We're not going to be actually authenticating any users here because we haven't covered the authentication yet. So don't worry about all of that authentication, authorization, and user and things like that. I just want to show you how we could assign a middleware to a specific route or group of routes. So just pretend that we have a user that is authenticated with some basic user, and we want to somehow gate that user from accessing this specific page. So to do that, we could use a middleware and register it only for this route. So this in here has a middleware method, and we can pass a specific middleware here. We can pass a single middleware here, or we could pass a list of middlewares. Let's maybe create a middleware called something like check user role. And we need to create this middleware. So let's open the terminal and we'll do check user role. Let's import that here and let's open that up. And in the handle method, we want to check if the authenticated user's role matches the admin role. But again, we haven't gotten that far yet, so we don't have that actual user object. So for now, we're just going to hard code it for the sake of the example. So we'll just assume that the user is logged in and store some user info in a variable like user equals ID 123 name geo role admin. Now again, once we cover the authentication, this will actually be part of a request. So you would be able to access the user object or user model. But for now, like I said, we haven't covered that. So just pretend that this is an actual authenticated user. So then we would want to check if the user role is admin and then return next request only if the user role is admin. Otherwise, we want to generate a new response with some kind of status, either 404 or maybe 403 for unauthorized. We're going to generate the 404 for now. So we'll do return response. We'll use the response helper function to create the proper response. And we'll do, instead of unauthorized 401, we'll simply do status 404. Now you can do many different things here. If the user is not admin, you could redirect the user to a different page, or you could create a completely different type of response. It is up to you how you would want to handle that within your app. Redirecting user to home page is probably the common way, but I personally don't like it because one, it gives the indicator to the user that, hey, this page exists, but I'm being redirected to home page due to some reason, probably because I don't have enough access. And that may or may not be okay depending on your application. Again, if we were to use the 403, that also kind of gives away that, hey, this page exists and it's a hidden page that only certain users can access to. But generating 404 just gives the indication that, hey, this page doesn't exist. Now in here, we're generating the response with status code 404, but you could also throw Laravel's HTTP not found exception, and it would essentially do the same thing. Let me show you first what it looks like with this, and then I'll show you what it looks like when you throw the HTTP not found exception, because with the exception, Laravel's exception handler handles that and renders the 404 page, which should look and feel consistent with the rest of the app, where this essentially just generates an empty response with 404. So let's test this out first. So we're going to open the browser. Let's go to administration, and we're getting secret admin page, again because our user is hard-coded to have the admin permissions. Let's go back to code. Let's remove this user's role, and I want to make it super clear that again, this is just an example. We're not actually logged in. This array does not mean the user is logged in. It just demonstrates a middleware example. We'll cover the proper authentication and proper user role checking later on. So let's refresh the page now, and we're getting a 404 response. Now this does not look consistent with the regular Laravel's 404 page, because if we go to some route that is not defined, we get this little slight better UI that the page doesn't exist. And this one is not really consistent with that, which again might give away information to the end user that, hey, this 404 page is slightly different from that 404 page, which means that this page might actually exist. So to fix that, instead of generating the response, we'll simply throw HTTP not found exception. Let's go back to the browser, refresh the page, and sure enough, we get the consistent 404 page. Now, instead of throwing this exception, we could also simply use one of Laravel's helper functions to essentially do the same thing. One of those is called abort, which allows you to pass the status code. So we'll do 404, and if we inspect this, we see that it calls the abort method on the app instance. So if we go in here, we see that if the code is 404, it simply throws the same not found HTTP exception. Otherwise, it throws the regular HTTP exception with the proper code and message and all that. So if we close that out and try this again, refresh, we get the same 404 page. Great, so now what if we wanted to have multiple admin specific routes? Adding this middleware to each route would work, but you could easily forget to add this middleware to all of your admin specific or hidden routes. That's where the grouping by middleware comes in. So let's say we had another route here called route get administration slash other or something like that. And we'll simply return text here, another admin page. And you could, of course, like I said, simply duplicate this and put it here, and this will work. Or you could group these two routes by the prefix and apply the middleware to the group. So you could do something like route prefix administration group, and then put these two routes in here. So let's put these two routes here. And we would add the middleware somewhere here. So we will do middleware and check user role. And then we would call the group. That means that we could remove it from here. So let's get rid of that, and let's get rid of this as well. And this should work. Let's test this out. So let's open the browser. Let's refresh the page. We're still getting 404 because we have that hard-coded in here. Let's bring this back to set this user to admin. So let's go back here, refresh, and that works. And we can visit the other page, and that works as well. Now, another way you could apply the middleware to a group of routes is maybe you didn't want to prefix it, right? Maybe you wanted to call the middleware directly. So you could actually just do it this way, and this would work. And then you could apply prefix afterwards if you wanted to. But yeah, you could just simply call the middleware on the route facade, and this will work the same way. Then you would need to do the prefixing either in here, or you would group them inside again by the prefix if you wanted to. But either way works. You could do the prefix here as well. So we'll just put the prefix in here, and it should work the same way. So just keep that in mind, that this group has to come after all your middleware prefix and things like that. Now, if we move this prefix after the group, even though it allows you to do that, it's not going to prefix by the administration. If we go back here, this is going to give us 404, but not because we don't have access, but because it simply doesn't exist. So if we change this back to admin, which means that now we should have access to this page, if we refresh, we're still getting 404 because that route is not being prefixed by this. We can actually confirm that by running artisan route list here and see that those routes are not being prefixed by administration. If we move this back and then run it again, then we see those routes right here. Now imagine you have multiple middlewares here. So instead of having check user role middleware alone, what if we had a list of middlewares, right? What if we had something like check user role and have some other middleware? Which means that the both of these middlewares would apply to all of the routes defined in this group. But now, what if you wanted to prevent one of the middlewares in this list for one of the routes? Like you still want to group all of these routes and apply all the rest of the middlewares. Maybe you have like 3 or 5 or 10 middlewares, I don't know. And then you wanted to exclude 1 or 2 middlewares from specific routes. You can do that in Laravel because there is a method called without middleware that you can add to individual routes. So in here, we can say something like without middleware and pass some other middleware here. And this is going to basically apply some other middleware to all the routes here except this one. And we can actually test this. Let me create this middleware. So we'll do PHP artisan make middleware, some other middleware, and then let's open that up. Let's first import some other middleware, and in here what I'm going to do is we're just going to dump other middleware just so that we can see this on screen to see where this middleware is being applied. So we're going to visit in browser now administration page, and then we'll visit administration other, and this middleware should be applied to the administration page, but it should not be applied to the other page. So let's open the browser. We'll go to the administration page first, and sure enough we see that it's applied. Now, if we go to the other page, we should not see that dump. And sure enough, we don't see that in here, which means that that middleware isn't being applied to this route. You could even apply the without middleware to a subset of routes. So if you had another group within here, maybe you were grouping another set of routes, you could apply this without middleware to that list of routes, and then it will be applied to all the routes in that group. So as you can see, it's pretty flexible. You can pretty much mix and match how you want to handle this and how you want to design your application. You could even call without middleware on the route facade itself. So you could do route without middleware and do some other middleware, and then do group like this, and then group bunch of routes in here. So maybe you had not just one route, but multiple routes that shouldn't have this middleware applied, and maybe they didn't have anything in common that you wanted to group them by. You could group them by this without middleware method. So let's open the browser just to double check. Let's refresh this page, and sure enough, it's not printing that middleware, which means it's not being applied to this route. But if we go to administration, it is being applied to this route. All right, let's continue. So Laravel actually has some of the default middleware groups already that get applied to certain routes. If we go back to the application builder class, so let's close these out from here, and let's go to application builder. Here we have the get middleware groups. So we covered the global middlewares. We covered how to assign middlewares to specific routes or to specific groups. Now we are at get middleware groups. So if we inspect this, we see that Laravel has two middleware groups here. One is web and the other is API. Web middlewares get applied to our web.php routes file, and API middlewares get applied to the API routes file, which we don't have it at this moment, but if you had the API routes file, this is essentially the middlewares that get assigned to those routes. So basically, our web requests go through these web middlewares in addition to the global and custom middlewares. You could append, prepend, replace, or even remove middlewares from the web and API middleware groups from within our Bootstrap app.php file. We could call the web method within here. So we could do something like middleware web, and then this method, as you can see, accepts append and prepend list of middlewares, as well as remove and replace options. So if we inspect this method, we see that it modifies the group web, and you can append, prepend, remove, or replace. You could also call the API method to do the same thing, append, prepend, remove, or replace the middlewares. If we wanted to assign the request ID only to the web requests, we could do it this way and comment it out from here, and then it wouldn't be applied to any other groups. Same goes for prepend. If you wanted to prepend instead of appending, you would do prepend. And then if you wanted to replace a specific middleware, let's say that we wanted to replace one of the web default middlewares. So let's say we wanted to replace maybe how the cookies are being encrypted, or how the CSR token gets validated, or how the session is started, or something like that. It doesn't matter. Let's say you wanted to replace one of these middlewares with your own custom middleware. The way you would do that is you would pass a key value pair, where you would take one of the middlewares that you want to replace, and you would make that as a key, and then the value would be the new middleware, so like custom encrypt cookies middleware, and this would essentially replace this middleware with this middleware. And another one that you can do is you can remove the middlewares. So you can pass list of middlewares that you want to remove from the default web middlewares. Now, in addition to this, you could use append to or prepend to group methods. So you could do prepend to group or append to group. And then you would pass the group name here. Let's say we wanted to put these two middlewares right here into its own group. Maybe we would call this check access or something like that. So we could call this something like check access, and then pass the list of middlewares here. So we could pass these two in here, like this. Let's import these classes, and then you would assign this group to individual or groups of routes using the name instead of the list of middlewares. So let's take this and go in here, and instead of passing an array here, we can pass the group name, which is check access, and this will work the same way. So if we go back to the browser, let's refresh the administration, we see that the middleware is being applied. And again, if we go to the other, this middleware is not going to be applied because we are removing that middleware in here using the without middleware method. Now we're using the append to group here to kind of create a new group of middlewares, right? But you don't have to do that. You could use that to append to any of the existing groups. If we go back to this middleware class here and search for the web method or the API method, which calls this modify group, if we inspect that, we see that when you pass the append, it calls the append to group. When you pass prepend, it calls the prepend to group, and so on. You could call these methods yourself because these are public methods. So you could call them from here like we're calling append to group, and essentially put this as web, and this is going to have the same effect as doing web and passing the appends or prepends like this. So like if we do it this way and then go to the web.php, and we remove this route middleware, right? Because we no longer have check access. So let's, instead of doing this, let's just do prefix and go back to the browser and refresh this page. We see that this page doesn't get that middleware, that other middleware applied, because again, we are using without middleware for this route. But if we remove this, we see that that middleware is assigned and it works, even though we haven't explicitly defined it for these routes. That's because we're appending to web middleware group, and web middleware group gets automatically assigned to all the web requests from the web.php. All right, there is also a way to define middleware aliases and pass parameters to middlewares. To define the alias for our middleware, we can use the alias method within the with middleware method. So we could do something like middleware alias and pass list of key value pairs here that are aliasing our middlewares. So let's say we wanted to alias check user role by calling it role, and then this will be aliased to check user role. And let's actually get rid of this from here. Let's bring this back. And if we go back to the web, let's bring it back here. And instead of check access, this is just going to be role, because that's our alias to that middleware. Now, to make sure that our role middleware is running, even with or without the role, let's simply dump some message here. So we'll say checking user role. Let's go to browser. Let's refresh the page, and sure enough, that middleware is applied here. And again, if we visit the other middleware is not applied, but the checking user role middleware is applied as expected. Now let's define this as a parameter in here. So let's say that we need the role as a parameter here. Basically, we're expecting the role arguments to be passed in here, and we'll just put this as role. And let's dump this right here, checking user role. And from within our web.php, we can actually pass that by using the colon here. So we can do role admin. And if we go to the browser and refresh the page, we see that it is getting passed in as expected. So now we could have basically a middleware for role admin. We can have middleware for role editor. And if we go here, doesn't have access to the administration page, so we're getting 404 and so on. Now, if you didn't have the alias and you still wanted to pass the argument, you could still do that. So you could do check user role like this and concatenate that with the argument, and this should still work. So if we go to the browser, refresh the page, we see that it works as expected. So as you can see, Laravel is pretty flexible. Laravel also provides plenty of useful middlewares and already has them aliased as well for your convenience. Like you have one for authentication called auth, you have one called can for authorization, and so on. If we open the middleware here and search for alias, there should be some default aliases here. So we have the get middleware aliases, which gets the default aliases. So if we go here, we see that Laravel already provides these aliases. So you have the auth, you have can, you have guest, you have signed, verified, and all that. And then you pass your own custom aliases, and then they get merged together. So as you can see and tell, Laravel is pretty flexible and it offers a variety of ways to configure and customize the framework to fit your needs. There is no like one defined correct way to do it. There are multiple ways to do things in Laravel, and one way doesn't necessarily mean that the other way is wrong. So you just have to sort of decide on how you like to structure your app and decide what you like and use that way for your applications. You don't need to know all of these different ways, of course. It's there for you when you do need to use them and when you do want to explore alternative ways. You can check the middleware documentation for more information because there are more features to middleware than what we discussed. Also, we learned how to define middlewares on the routes, but could define them in controllers as well using the has middleware interface, which would make you define the static middleware method. So let's say we wanted to define some kind of middleware for the transaction controller. We would implement the has middleware interface, and this contract has middleware method that needs to be defined, and it's a static method, and this returns an array which is list of middlewares. And in here, again, you can just pass the alias of the middleware or the fully qualified class name of the middleware, or you could also pass a closure if you wanted to define your middleware right here instead of creating a middleware class. So just keep this in mind that you could define middlewares on the controller level as well. I personally don't like defining middlewares in controllers. I prefer them in routes, but there are different use cases for this. And if you prefer them in controllers, you can do that. As I mentioned, there are multiple ways to do things in Laravel, and one way doesn't necessarily mean the other way is incorrect. All right, so this is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. Until next time, happy coding.